All right. Thanks for clicking on the video. My name's Cameron Buckner, and this is the Dixiecryptid podcast. I have 3 stories narrated by Dummy here. And then after that, I was at a camp out this weekend with some friends. Some of them, most of them, well, really all of them are Bigfoot. Bigfoot is an interest to them. And I got a few, it took a little bit, but I got a few of them to start talking about some of their experiences. And I'm going to drop, I think I have 5 or 6 pretty good interviews or stories from people around a campfire. And I'm going to drop 1, maybe 2 if they're short in the next 4 or 5 videos, and just to spice this up. And their stories are much better than mine. And this first one is at the end of this video. And the storyteller is Debbie Jones. And Debbie is a natural storyteller. She's really good at it. She's got a good resonant voice, and it sounds good on the mic, and all my recording gear worked fine. And I got a story that I've been wanting to share with you all since I started this podcast. She told me this story several years ago. I asked her, I said, would you ever let somebody record this story? She was like, sure. Well, 3 years later, I finally got to do it. So let me quit talking. Let's get into these first 3 stories that I narrate. Then we'll listen to Debbie's story. And hopefully y'all all have a good time. That's the point of this whole thing. All right, let's get this train rolling. All right, here we go. Here's a story from Parker, and here's what he writes. I'm 13 years old, and I live about 30 miles from Kansas City, Kansas. My family's always hunted, but we love to fish more than anything. My dad has fished the, can't pronounce this, Marius des Cangas River all his life. I'm just not even going to try that one. He started taking me with him when I was about 5. Dad and I had been on a roll, slamming monster channel cats all summer. Our goal was to catch big flatheads, since I've never caught one before. I was really determined to do that when we got to the river 2 days ago. It was 7 p.m. and about 30 minutes until dusk when we got there. We checked out a few other places before we settled on my grandfather's favorite spot. It didn't take long to unload the truck and get set up. And then 10 minutes later, we were already getting big bites, so we knew it was going to be a good night. Everything was going great. We were having a lot of fun. Dad brought everything we needed to roast hot dogs on the fire, so I was busy cooking myself a couple while I kept an eye on the poles. And I love the feeling of being out there. About the time we caught the first nice channel cat and the fish were starting to make a run, that feeling changed. Everything got eerie all of a sudden. It was still and quiet. Behind us, we started hearing brush popping. No sooner did we zero in on that than something was thrown at us out of the darkness and landed right next to us. And then something else was thrown and landed in the water. Well, I kept hearing something stomping right behind me. I turned the spotlight on it several times, but I never saw anything. I was already feeling pretty unnerved when I looked over at my dad, and I could tell right away that he wasn't feeling right about any of this either. That made it all worse for me. If he didn't feel right, this sure couldn't be my imagination. About that time, I started to get the sensation that I was being watched. It was a really creepy feeling in my gut. More branches were popping. That same stomping sound kept getting worse. And by now, I was almost insanely afraid. I had never experienced anything like this before. The sounds and sensing a presence watching me, things being thrown at us, it was worse than anything I could have imagined. So I tried to stay calm and not say anything. I didn't want my dad to think I was a wuss, even though I knew it wasn't in my mind. Finally, Dad said, if we aren't getting any bites in the next 30 minutes, I think it's time to leave. I felt a bit of relief, but just then he cussed and pointed to the sky downriver. Instantly, I saw what he was pointing at. It was the most absurd thing I have ever seen. There was a bright red dot flickering like a star, but it was going nuts. The whole sky in that direction seemed red. The thing moved up and down, left and right, and then up again. Eventually it flew out of sight so quickly that it was like it was moving faster than light. We sat there. Whatever was behind us was still watching us. It was still popping the trees and stomping around. After about 20 minutes, Dad said, "Son, we need to go," and I agreed. It was 2:30 when we started carrying stuff up to the truck. As we were standing there loading our stuff, something big started popping branches in the trees across the road from us. So I shined a spotlight, but again, I didn't see anything. We made 2 more trips down to get our stuff. We moved as fast as we could, but it still felt like forever. And then we got out of there. We were heading down the narrow gravel road that we'd come in on, and we were talking about all the things we had just seen. And then we came up on 3 big logs with brush piled on top of them, blocking our path. They were just laying there like they were meant to be a wall. They weren't there earlier. Dad thought about driving through it, and I'd have been okay with that. But he knew the truck wouldn't make it. He had no choice but to get out and manually move it all aside. My father moved every piece of brush out of the way. I never saw him move so fast in my life. Then he got back in the truck and he floored it. We didn't slow down or speak a word until we got to the highway. And once we were on the main road, I asked him what he thought it was that was messing with us. He said he didn't know, but he admitted to having that same super uneasy feeling that I experienced. I really have no idea what it was either, but I believe it was Bigfoot. It could have been paranormal, but what paranormal beings stacked 60-pound logs across the road? We may never know for sure what it was, but when things went from great to terrifying, I was just glad that we trusted our gut instinct and got out of there. Well, Parker, I think that was a smart move too, brother. I'm glad your dad had enough sense about him to get y'all out of there. And I know he does. He's looking after you, man. But you don't want to ruin a good fishing trip if you're kind of not sure what it is. I mean, a lot of weird things could happen before I'd leave a good night catching a bunch of catfish on the bank of a river. And then these lights in the distance, that's real interesting. Someone told me a story about that this weekend. I actually recorded it. I'm going to put it in a podcast, in an upcoming podcast, about lights moving through the woods and lights above the woods that these lights are moving in. And it is a fascinating story. It'll probably be about 4 podcasts down the road, but I'm putting that in there. But it's the same thing, Parker, same thing y'all saw. And the noises and stuff, I don't know, buddy. 13 years old and you got to experience something really weird. I'm sure you will never forget. Buddy, thanks for sending the story, and tell your dad thanks for letting you write it for me. I really appreciate it. Hope you're doing well, Parker. Hope you're doing well in school this year. Thanks for the story, buddy. Let's take a little break between stories, and I'd like to mention to you, maybe make a suggestion for you to take a look at Yeti Bar Soap Company for your upcoming Christmas gifts. You know, there are shortages of all kind of stuff I'm hearing on the news to get your Christmas shopping done early. Yeti Bars is stocked full of everything. As a matter of fact, right now they've got overstock. So much so that they're offering free shipping on any orders over $70 through the holidays. And in Canada, there'll be free shipping on orders over $150. It's the home of the family Yeti chest and the small Yeti chest. They say come clean like a beast. If you'll take a look at their website at yetibars.net, you're going to find all kinds of stuff. Deodorants, soaps, swag as they call it, coffee cups, decanters, T-shirts, hats, children's books, all kinds of things for Christmas. Any order over $70 is free shipping. Take a look, do your Christmas shopping now. And at the end, when you get ready to check out, enter the discount code DC10 and they'll knock 10% off the total. Go check them out, yetibars.net, and Yeti Bars on Facebook. They'd love to hear from you. This email is from Susan, and here's what she writes. I was 17 years old in 1969 when my brother asked me if I'd like to join him on a 3-day hike up in the backcountry of Yosemite National Park. He had just come home from Vietnam. Even though I had camped out many times with my family, I had never been on a hike for that long before, so I said yes. The first day, we followed a steep path that dropped 1,000 feet to the river. It was about the end of April, which is early spring in the high country, and Yosemite is a big place. We didn't see anyone else throughout the entire trip as we traveled over hill and dale in the beautiful Sierra Nevada mountains. The first night we camped near a babbling stream. After lunch the next day, we walked through a sunny alpine meadow covered in light green knee-high spring grasses and flowers. The meadow was situated in a valley surrounded by tall wooded hills, and it was a spectacular sight. And then we entered an aspen forest dappled with sunlight. There we noticed the faint smell of a skunk. It was weak enough that we figured the skunk must have left some time ago, so we kept on walking. Further into the grove, we came across a newly built windowless ranger shed constructed of thick corrugated steel. All the necessary tools and equipment to repair trails in the backcountry were kept there, so the forest rangers wouldn't have to haul them back and forth. We knew this because the front and one side were torn off with the heavy metal corrugated panels scattered all over the nearby woods. We stood there gawking at it for several minutes, trying to figure out how this could have happened. My brother said it must have been a big bear, freshly awake from its winter hibernation, that did it. But on closer inspection, there were neither claw marks nor teeth marks on any of the 8-foot-long panels. Some of them were curled into themselves like a C, and others were thrown up to 30 feet away. It was as if someone tall had peeled the sheets off like peeling a banana and tossed them aside. Nothing inside the shed was disturbed. Whatever peeled away the panels had no interest in the contents. The bears in California are mostly small brown bears, like on our state flag. I doubt a bear like that could have reached high enough on the shed to grab the top of a panel and rip it away. It was unnerving to consider what might have been able to do that kind of damage. "Let's get out of here and put a few miles between us and this place before we stop for the night," my brother said. I was more than happy to comply. Neither of us had ever heard the word Sasquatch or Bigfoot at the time. My brother was carrying a small hunting knife, but that was it. We had no guns and no bear spray. A small steady breeze kicked up in the late afternoon that stayed with us all night. When we got there, we were too tired from our long hike to build a fire, so we had supper of salami and cheese on bread with a side of fruit. And then we hung our food pack up in the tree and went to bed, and the wind gently swayed our tent for the whole night. The sun had not quite set behind the tall trees when we fell asleep. Sometime later, something woke me up. I had been dreaming that I was having a conversation with someone who reminded me of little Abner. I know I'm dating myself now, so I should explain that little Abner was a comic strip character in the Sunday comics when I was growing up. He was a big, dark-haired man with muscles like Arnold Schwarzenegger. I'm not entirely sure the person in my dream was human, or that it was even a dream. In any case, we talked for a short time, and then something completely woke me up. Instantly, I realized something heavy just outside the tent was hitting the ground next to my head, and I could feel the vibration of the impacts. I laid there frozen in fear as it, whatever it was, took a long, inhaling sniff only 12 inches from my head. There was no doubt that it had taken in my scent right through the thin material of our pup tent. Too afraid to move, I listened intently to see if it would move to my brother's side of the tent and sniff there. Instead, it grabbed the tent pole by our heads and started shaking violently. Wake up, I screamed, and as soon as I began to speak, the shaking stopped, so my brother didn't see it. He accused me of having a nightmare induced by the sight of that shed and told me to go back to sleep. And then he rolled over with his back to both me and the tent pole. Again, something grabbed the pole and shook it violently for 3 seconds. There's something outside shaking the tent, I said. It's just the wind, he answered angrily. Please go back to sleep. My brother is more than just a brother. He and I are great friends. Never before nor since had he ever spoken so gruffly to me. That was as much a shock as the tent shaking. I was between a rock and a hard place, and I was sweating bullets from the fear of what was outside and thoroughly crushed by my brother's reaction. Well, I laid there and fought back the panic and frustration and listened for anything that might be moving around outside the tent. The gentle breeze covered all the subtle noises, and finally, either from shock or exhaustion, I fell asleep. At daybreak, we got up. There were no signs of anything having been around the tent, so we took down the pack and had some water. We decided we'd walk a couple of miles and then stop and eat breakfast. My brother was like a mountain goat, and I had twisted my ankle on the first day, so I was constantly lagging 75 feet behind him. But as we walked along, I began to have a dialogue in my head as if someone were interviewing me in a sort of a get-acquainted, friendly talking manner. It was as if someone else was asking the questions and I was answering them. We were still in that high valley, so there were no trees on either side of our trail. Clearly there was no one around me, but the conversation continued in my head for a mile or so. I felt a presence, so I kept glancing around to see if anyone was there, but no one was there. And still the questions kept popping into my head, and I kept answering them. And then suddenly it stopped. It was as if the interview was over. And when it was over, I felt a little silly for having thought about myself and my life as if someone were there listening to me. It was a bright sunlit day, but I was alone. Why would I go on and on about my life and my family like that? I've only recently learned about mind speak and knew nothing of it at the time, and it was a very strange feeling. Well, at that point, I decided to enjoy the walk, and eventually we were back at the big trees again. And there we came across a log jam around a deep pool blocking our way. The trees were about 3 feet in diameter. My brother went around to the right where it was real swampy, and I chose to go to the left and jump from log to log while keeping my feet as dry as possible. But one log turned out to be a bad choice. The far end was anchored on the bank, but the end closest to me was under the log that I had been standing on, and I soon learned it was just floating in the water. And as soon as I jumped down on it, it began to sink. The crystal clear pool was about 8 to 10 feet deep, and as I jumped, I heard "run" in my mind. With a burst of speed, I made it to the other end of the 25-foot log before it sank too deep and dumped me in the icy snowmelt. It was the easiest run I had ever experienced. It felt like I was feather light, even with a pack. It was almost like someone was pushing me while lifting up the pack to take the weight off me. The log was sinking fast, but I seemed to be flying over it. I managed to get across with only one wet foot. Even as I was running, though, I couldn't help but think, what is happening to me? At the other end, my brother was blanched white as he fumbled to get his pack off. He thought he was going to have to dive in and help me out. At 17, it hadn't occurred to me just how dangerous the route I had taken was, and that maneuver in particular was very dangerous. If I had fallen in with the backpack, the water absorbed by the sleeping bag alone could have been enough to drag me under. This probably all sounds ridiculous to anyone listening, but it is how I remember it. Something weird happened on that log. There's no way anyone could have been behind me. No one was there but my brother, and he was in front of me. Even if someone had been there, their weight would have caused the log to sink even more. The explanation I have come up with is absurd to say the least. Many thoughts have run through my mind. Was an invisible hovering Sasquatch pushing me along and holding up my backpack? Or was something helping a human to save a life? It's definitely one for the book of the weird. Now, I know I'm probably making a mountain out of a molehill. I wouldn't blame you if you laughed at my story. I'm laughing right along with you. The only reason I think Sasquatch is because of the destroyed ranger shed and the smell of the skunk just before we found it. Now, I suppose it could have been any benevolent spirit who saved me, but something did. As unbelievable as it sounds, it is exactly what happened. Nothing else of any significance happened on that trip. We never spoke of it again, and I forgot all about it. In recent years, I've listened to a lot of Bigfoot stories on YouTube. It wasn't until recently, though, when another person mentioned being sniffed through their tent that all that came back to me. Having something large sniff you through a tent is incredibly unsettling. Perhaps that's what caused me to repress the memory until now. I never saw a Sasquatch, nor do I know what the interviewing thing was. I'm just glad that whatever or whoever it was there to save my life when I needed it on that log. And God bless them for that. Well, Susan, who is to say that wasn't a Bigfoot? I can't imagine that. I don't know. Bigfoot are big, animate, opaque, biological entities, and I really don't know what to say about it. But your guess is as good as anybody's. I mean, it could be a Bigfoot. Maybe it was an angel Bigfoot. I don't know. Maybe it was a guardian angel. Maybe God's got some kind of plan for you later in your life. He didn't want you to go right then. It wasn't your day. I mean, there are 1,000 different explanations. But if you backtrack and you think about something big stomping around and shaking your tent poles and then sniffing you through the tent, that's pretty odd. I don't know. Maybe you had on some perfume, or maybe I don't know. Something that caught its attention. And I'm just blabbering. I really have anything to say about this other than to say anybody's guess is as good as Susan's, but hers is probably better because she was there and she's thought about it a lot. And I really appreciate this story, Susan. It was really good. Really, really interesting to me. I appreciate it. Thank you, ma'am. Here's a story from a man who I don't know what his name is, but at some point in the story, he says his name. So I'm assuming he doesn't really care if his name is out there, but let's get to the story. It's a Bigfoot story. It's really good. When I was 9, our family lived in Plummer, Idaho, a small logging town in the Panhandle. We actually lived on 10 acres of land in the hills several miles outside of town. My 2 older brothers were avid hunters who would go on extended hunting trips, and they'd leave from our house and head out to the middle of nowhere, pick a spot where they wanted to hunt, and then build a shelter out of fallen timber where they'd stay for the duration of their hunt. One year they asked me if I wanted to go. I would get to stay in one of their timber shelters. They would cook for me over the campfire, and they'd even let me shoot one of their rifles. They promised it would be a lot of fun. I asked my dad if it'd be okay, and after they assured him that they would take good care of me, he agreed to let me go. We headed out on a Friday evening, and I remember the day because it meant I would be missing Saturday morning cartoons the next morning. Oh man, anything that interrupted Saturday morning cartoons was horrible for me too, brother. I agree with that. But I digress. For a kid, that was a big deal, but this sounded like more fun. Besides, I really wanted to fire my brother's 30-30 rifle, even if it would probably knock me on my butt. We crammed into the front seat of my brother's regular cab pickup and headed further into the mountains. It seemed like it took forever, so I think we must have been up there quite a way. Of course, I was still a kid, and so the distance may have been exaggerated in my mind, but it seemed like it took a really long time. We finally parked in a clearing outside of the main tree line, and we hiked the rest of the way in. We went far enough in that one of my brothers had to carry me on his back for the last half of the walk to the campsite. And by the time we got there, it was getting late. At least it was for me, so I sat on a log and watched as my brother set up the camp and started a fire. Then we went into the shelter, crawled into our sleeping bags, and we fell asleep. The next morning, we got up at the start of the day, but our food supply was gone. My brothers had hung it in a large pine tree the night before. I remember it looking impossibly high to my juvenile mind. There were broken branches all over the ground around that tree. These were big branches, not just little branches, and they were broken off way up the trunk. My older brother, who was 6'5" tall, remarked that he would have had to use a 10-foot ladder to get up there. My oldest brother was sure it wasn't a bear because he'd chosen a branch that stuck out from the tree and black bears would be too small to reach it. He figured even a grizzly wouldn't have been able to get up to that bag. They both looked pretty confused and angry. Now we would have to leave the next day, which meant that they would only have one day to hunt. It was just sad, really, and I was looking forward to having bacon and eggs cooked on the campfire. They'd brought just enough jerky and snacks to get us through the next morning, so my oldest brother went hunting while my other brother decided to stay in camp and teach me how to fire the rifle. He really only stayed because my legs were so sore from the long hike in, even though he'd carried me halfway. That evening, my oldest brother returned to camp empty-handed. He told us that it had been a very strange day. While he was out there, he didn't see any signs of anything. He didn't see any of the usual small forest animals. He didn't even see any birds. He couldn't find any deer tracks when there were usually tons of them. Plus, there was a strange, horrible smell. My older brother mentioned that he'd smelled something weird the night before, too. Well, disappointed that the trip had been a bust, we crawled into our sleeping bags that night with plans to pack up and leave the next morning. But it wasn't long before we heard branches breaking and knocking sounds just outside camp. Then something started grunting, and we all sat up to listen. At first, my brothers thought it was other hunters, but the grunting got louder, and it was accompanied by something really big stomping around. My oldest brother grabbed his rifle and stuck his head out to look around. He popped right back in and yelled, "Grab the guns! We're leaving now!" My other brother started to pack, but my oldest brother told him to leave everything else and to carry me on his back the whole way. At this point, I was really scared and I had started crying. The last thing I remember was a strange howling sound. It wasn't like a dog or a coyote or a wolf. This was deeper and louder. The hike back to the truck took what felt like hours. When we got there, my brother threw me into the cab and we were gone. I don't know what it was out there that night. I never saw it, but neither of my brothers ever hunted that area again. And over the years, I've tried to get my oldest brother to tell me what he saw. And after all this time, he still won't talk about it. Well, I think his name was Ted. That's two stories from adolescent kids or experiences by adolescent kids that I'm sure you guys will never forget. I mean, I remember being that age and my dad saying, "Hey, you want to go deer hunting?" And I was like, I was like a little girl who had just been asked out on a date. "Oh yeah, Dad, yeah." And I remember, and I did this for years, but I would sleep in front of my mom and dad would close their bedroom door at night, and I would sleep in front of his door so he would kick me when he came through, because if I wasn't up when he was up, he would leave me, and he was teaching me to get up on time. And so that was the only sure way. That was the only sure way that I wouldn't get left. And, but yeah, I slept in front of his door and he'd kick me when he came out and then I would get up. I remember that excitement going with brothers and fathers to go deer hunting and fishing and all that stuff is just awesome. So to be honest, that's kind of what this story was to me. It brought back memories of my childhood well, fishing and hunting with my father, and it was great. So, thanks for sending the story. It was awesome, and I really appreciate it. And let's move to something else. Okay, I'm about to share with you Debbie Jones' story, but just I need to set this up. What you're going to hear is right off the bat is her winding up another story that she had been telling, and she was just telling somebody there around the campfire about an experience her and some of the girls with Sisters of the Moon had had. I just happened to hit the record button and got it, and I had planned on editing it out, but it's really worth listening to. And then when I asked her to tell us about the experience and how her daddy handled it, then she gets into that. And so, okay, so now you know what you're going to be hearing. Let's let Debbie start talking here. She's awesome.
5-ish that next morning, something came into camp, but this had a totally different feel, and we could actually see the shadows on the tent. It was huge, and we could make out the shoulders and head. And another one came up to the left side of it, and it was coming up from the front of our tent where the fire was out there. And I pushed on Sandy's cot with my foot, and she looked over, and I went, she looked up, and she could see the shadows. And she pushed on Barbara's tent and did the same thing. So they all saw that. You could hear the footfall. And I had my recorder going out in the back left corner of my tent, and Barbara had hers out in the front. So anyway, they walk around. You could hear them moving. They weren't running around throwing crap at us like we think juveniles, you know. But anyway, it was just a totally different feel. And I've never been scared or felt any kind of fear until then, you know. And so anyway, it was 6:29 because I keep my phone under my pillow so I can see what time it is. 6:29 from the back left corner where my audio recorder is, it was this high-pitched, female-sounding scream. And it was real shrill, and then it ended in like a whoop. And then 10 seconds later, another one it was the same being that did it, I'm sure, because it was the exact same scream, exact same area, same thing. And we were like, that's the Medusa scream. That guy was legit. We understood now what he was talking about, but it was Bigfoot, I'm sure. Yeah. So the next night, same exact stuff. Those juveniles, they're back, you know, little less activity, you know, and then that next morning, about the same time, they come into camp again. It did it 3 nights in a row. The 4th night it was raining, and it was a lot less activity, but we still had them coming into camp. But on that second night, if you went on past where that guy had been camping, you go another several miles down and the road ends, and there's a campground. And there were some bear hunters down there. And we had talked to them every day. We'd go down there because we wanted to keep up with who was where, you know. And so the second night, way off in that direction where the bear hunters were, we heard 4 gunshots. And I said, well, they're either drinking and getting rowdy or they're having something going on in camp. And then just not even a minute or so later, we heard 2 more gunshots. And then within a minute or so, we heard that Medusa scream from that area over there. And I'm like, oh yeah, they're having activity. That's what they're shooting at. And so we were excited. And then the 3rd night, somewhere between them and us, we heard the Medusa scream again. And so we're like, that poor young guy must have been scared out of his mind. But anyway, that was really cool because we thought he was on drugs or something, talking about sounding like a
killer carried a sword around with him.
Yeah, yeah.
It's funny when you say Medusa scream. You call my sister that.
Really?
Yeah. Every time you say Medusa, I'm like, yeah, she doesn't really scream.
I know. That's what I was like. We even talked about it after he left. You know, before we went down there, I'm like, what was he talking about? Medusa scream. It just didn't make sense, but then we were like, okay. Because it did. It was so high-pitched. You know how you hear on movies pterodactyls and stuff? Yeah. That's exactly what it was reminiscent of. But I got excited because my recorder was right in that corner where that screen was coming from. Cool. And Barbara went ahead that next morning and got hers and played it back, and it picked it up good on hers, and hers was in front. So when Shelley listens to it, she ought to hear something good on there. Well, it was really high pitched, and all three of us, we all said it sounded female. But we just had a feeling that it was like an alpha female. I think she was finally like saying, "This is it, leave this." Yeah. So it was pretty interesting.
Kitties saying, "Let's go now."
Mhm.
That's fascinating.
I'd never heard that scream like that before, and if it hadn't had the whoop on the end, I would have said, "Don't know what the heck that was," but it had a whoop on the end. Well, I've heard other stuff, but not sound like that.
Tell them about your daddy and y'all's experience down there.
Well, where I grew up, I lived in Malta, Texas. We only had just a few hundred people in the little community. The school went to 8th grade, and I was valedictorian in my 8th grade class. And I normally don't tell people, but there was only 3 of us. But we had like 2 grades in each classroom, so 5th and 6th were together, 7th and 8th were together. And once you got out 8th grade, you had to go to high school in either New Boston, which was 7 miles in one direction, or in DeKalb, which was 7 miles in the opposite direction. And I ended up going to both, and so because DeKalb was just more down to earth, I think. And anyway, so where this place was located, though, was only probably about 30, 40 miles from Fouke, Arkansas, which is legendary in the Bigfoot community, because of the legend of Boggy Creek. And a lot of my cousins lived up in Texarkana and in that area, and some of my cousins lived in Fouke. And my mama and daddy had adopted me when they were 41, and so I already had 2 brothers that were 20 some odd years older than me. So all my first cousins were in their 20s, and so I grew up with my second cousins, and I grew up playing with my second cousins in those woods in Fouke, Arkansas. But back then, when I was a kid, we didn't know that Bigfoot even existed. We didn't know what a Bigfoot was, and I didn't even really know about it until I was in my early 20s or so. But what we called that creature in Fouke, Arkansas was the Fouke monster. That's all we ever heard was the Fouke monster. My mama and daddy and everybody would say, "Oh, honey, that's not real." But then the Legend of Boggy Creek movie came out, and we went to see it, and she really had to tell me that because it said, based on true events. And I went with my cousins, and we were all looking at our parents like, "What?" And they were saying, "No, honey, that's just a movie. They just do that to make it more exciting." And so we were like, okay, Anyway, when I was about 14 years old, it was Christmas time. And my mama was sick. She had cancer, and so she was in the bed in the front room of our house. And my daddy and I were on the front porch hanging Christmas lights, and they were blue Christmas lights. And so it didn't light up very much, and we had the front porch light off because we could see better where we were putting them and spacing the Christmas lights out. We had a long house. It was almost like, a long shotgun type house. On the left-hand side of the porch was the carport. Then on the right, it was just, we had woods all the way around us and a pond back behind us and a dirt road in front of us. It was so dark out there, and we were on the right-hand side of the house, opposite from the carport. And when we were hanging the Christmas lights, coming from the left hand, further on down, away from us, sounded like it was coming from on the other side of where my mama's house used to be next door. We heard just this, it was so scary. It was like a moan, a roar, and a growl all together. And I had never heard anything like that before, and it was so loud, it's just, and it scared the crap out of me. And I looked at my daddy, and I was like, "What was that, Daddy?" And he just paused for a second, and he said, "I don't know what that was, but let's just hurry up and finish this." Well, my daddy, like I said, he was 41 when he adopted me, and that was back in 66 when I was born. So my daddy had been in 3 wars, Vietnam, World War II, and Korea. And he never was scared of anything. But I could just tell that, he stopped and looked in that direction, but he's like, "Let's go ahead and finish this." And so I was like, "Well, let's go in." Because I've never heard anything like that before. And he was like, no, let's just go ahead and finish this. And so we're trying to get it up. And thank goodness it was not a very long porch. But as we're working our way to the left, we get to about the center and we hear it again. But this time it's closer up. And he says, go in the house and get my gun. And I said, I'm not leaving you out here. And I said, please, come on, let's go in the house. He goes, no, just hurry up, go in the house and get my gun. I said, no, Daddy. I was about starting to cry, I said, let's go in the house, please. And about that time, from the carport area, we heard it again. And this time I just busted out in tears, and he's pushing me in the house, and he just pushes right on by me. Well, my mama was, right there in that first front room in the bed, and she sees me, crying, and he's running through the house going to go find his gun, then he's coming back out, and she's like, what's going on? And I'm like, there's a monster outside, and it's roar, and I'm trying to make the sound for her, and I'm worried because Daddy now has just gone out there, and so I go into my room, which was on the opposite side from where my mama was, and on the side that the carport was on, and I'm looking out the windows, following him around the house to make sure nothing got him. And he comes back in there, and he's like, there's nothing out there. I don't see anything at all. And he had a flashlight, and had his gun and all that. And I'm still just shaking, and Mama's scared now. So he tells me, he said, go in there and call your Aunt Overly. Now, my Aunt Overly was my mama's sister, and they had all grown up in that area. And Aunt Overly was already in her probably 60s at this time. So she had lived there forever and ever. And so I'm in there telling her what we just heard, roaring and growling and moaning on the phone, trying to make this sound. And she said, oh, honey, that's probably just Miss Clay Schulte's bulls across the street from us, And Miss Clay Schulte was an elderly woman, lived there by herself, and she did. She had, her husband had passed away, but she still had the bulls and the cows and the chickens and all that. There was a water tower over on the right side of her pasture and everything, and I'm telling you, we were in the country. Anyway, so that made me feel better, made my mama and daddy feel better. And so we slept okay. Well, the next day, Miss Clay Schulte was at our house because she would come and give Mama her shots for pain relief. And so she was up there in the front room. My daddy was in there, and he calls me and asked me to come up. I was in the back of the house where the living room was at. And he said, Debbie, come up here and make that sound that we heard last night from Miss Clay Schulte. And she's just sitting there, rocking in the rocking chair. And so he had already told her the story. And so I'm up there roaring and moaning and growling. And she's like, oh, Mr. Bob, I wish you hadn't told me that. And he said, no, it's okay, because Overly told me that it was probably y'all's bulls or something. And she said, oh, no, Mr. Bob, I don't have any of my cows or my bulls over there right now. They're all up in DeKalb. And I don't remember what was having done. I can't remember exactly. It's like they were being bred or something. But anyway, she said, there's none of my bulls or cows are over there right now. And she says, as a matter of fact, something's been stealing my chickens. Of course, we didn't know anything about anything at that time. We didn't know anything about Bigfoot. Looking back, I remember I was Daddy's girl, and anywhere Daddy went, I helped him with everything. He had killed a possum one time that was up around the house, and it was late in the evening, so we didn't have time to bury it. And so he said, well, let's just go around back, we'll put it in the trash can. We had, metal trash can. And so he said, we'll put it in the trash can, we'll come back out in the morning, we'll bury it. And so he put the lid on it, and he put a big old rock on top of the lid so nothing would get into it and get it. And so the next day, he called me and he said, come on, let's go out and bury the possum. And we go out the back door, and, the trash can's still sitting there with the lid and the rock and everything. So he takes the rock off, takes the lid off. He said, looked at me, what'd you do? I said, what are you talking about? He said, the possum's gone. And I said, Daddy, I didn't get that possum. I didn't do anything with that possum. He said, you serious? And I said, no. And, we had no clue what had happened, but that lid was still on it, and that rock was still on that lid. But that possum was gone. So something had to have taken that heavy. I mean, it was a big rock. It was at least, the rock was at least like a foot all the way around, foot width, foot wide, foot high. It was a heavy rock. That was interesting. So now, looking back, I'm like, oh, yeah. Yeah. And we would hear all sorts of stuff. We'd hear high-pitched screams. When we first moved there, I was a lot younger, but there was a railroad track on the other side of that water tower. And we used to hear screams, and it sounded like a woman screaming. And so, of course, Aunt Overly lived there, and we'd always call Aunt Overly anytime we didn't know what was going on. And she said, no, we thought it was the little old lady that lived in that little white house by the water tower getting beat up or something. And she's like, oh, no, that's that Black Panther that walks up and down the railroad tracks. And so that's just what I always thought, that was. And it may have been a panther for all I know. But, yeah, there was lots of strange things going on around there.
And that wasn't really the catalyst that got you interested. You just reflect back on that and you put those things together, right?
Right. Yeah, I mean, because there's...
I just love that. It's not the craziest story in the world.
Right.
It's not the most action-packed. But she told me that story 3 years ago? And
3 or
I
4.
asked her, I said, would you ever retell that on camera? And she goes, sure. And I haven't really seen her much or had an opportunity to do it since then. So
it's just so cool, looking back. And I remember, too, I dated a guy from Foreman, Arkansas. And but I've always been interested in, the Fouke monster. I just didn't know what it was, We knew that there was supposed to be a monster. And some people called him the boogeyman. My mama would always, when she said, well, you be careful going out there, the boogeyman will get you. We just thought that was a saying back then. But the Fouke monster, once we started hearing about the Fouke monster and stuff, and then the movie was made about Boggy Creek, we thought, okay, even though Mama and Daddy is telling us it's not real, when you start having people in the area talking about it, you listen to that stuff. A guy I dated was from Foreman, Arkansas, and he had said that him and his daddy would go hunting in Foreman, and that's not too far from Fouke either, He said that he remembers one time that they were coming out of the woods. They had parked alongside of the road, and there was a big pasture out there, and then the pasture was lined with trees and stuff. And he said that we're sitting in the front yard of my house in the car talking about this, and because I had told him about what I had heard, a couple of years earlier, because I was dating him when I was 16 and he was 17, and so we're talking about stuff, and I was telling him about what I had heard when I was 14 and everything. So he starts telling me this, and he said, well, we were loading up the truck, putting our guns and stuff in there, and my daddy kept staring across the pasture. And he goes, and I looked over there, and he said, what are you looking at? And he goes, do you see that creature? And he said there was an upright creature walking along the tree line on the backside of the pasture, and it just went into the woods. And I remember, but while he was telling me that, I was like, do you think it could have been the Fouke monster? And he slung his car door up and went, ah! Like he was being pulled out of the car. And I screamed bloody murder, and my daddy came out on the front porch to see what was going on. But what's funny is we're Facebook friends, now on Facebook, and he had been living in North Carolina. And him and his family were going to move back to Arkansas, but they found a cattle farm in Oklahoma. So they're living in Oklahoma now. And I'll post stuff on my Facebook sometimes, my personal Facebook about Bigfoot. And then I share the show and stuff, and then I'll delete it after I've shared it and stuff. But anyway, so he was seeing Bigfoot stuff. And so he messaged me after he moved to Oklahoma. And where he's living now is not far from where we recorded the gibberish, what we call Tribulation Bay. So he started asking me questions. Well, does Bigfoot do this? And do they do that? And do they do this? And so I said, why are you asking me all this stuff? And he said, well, my daughter's dating a guy, and he said that he's been hearing some weird stuff, and he's describing all this stuff. And I'm like, that sounds really interesting, Todd. And he goes, well, do you think it could be Bigfoot? And I said, I think it could. I don't know if it is, but I think it could. And I said, where does he live? And he was telling me, and so I'm pulling up Google Maps. He said he lives just 3 miles from me. And so he's telling me where he lives. I said, can you just send me a pin on Google Maps, it was like 5 miles from Tribulation Bay where we recorded the gibberish.
Wow.
And I told him, I said, you don't want to hear what I'm fixing to tell you. And he's like, what? And I said, your house is real close to this? He's like, yeah. And I said, let me send you a link. And so I sent him the link that Carrie Arnold did on Sisters of the Moon where we're talking about all that.
Yeah.
I said, you're going to hear a story where we recorded gibberish and had a lot of activity. I said, that's about 5 miles from y'all's farm. And he was like, yeah. So now he's all the time sending me stuff. But it's pretty cool.
Thanks for watching the video. Thanks, Debbie Jones, for telling us your story. And thanks to all the writers who have sent in these stories from this point all the way back to the beginning of the podcast in September of 2018. It's been just an awesome ride, and I have hundreds more to do. So we're going to keep this show going. I really appreciate your support. I appreciate you listening, and we'll see you guys on the next podcast. Thanks.